Good afternoon, Facebook and YouTube. Welcome back to another Sunday Stuff. I am Rob from the Flying Hunt Archery and Leather, and I wanted to talk to you today about a couple more things that were neat little odds and ends I've got in my collection and wanted to show you how to identify them. Okay, so a couple of things. Now, we talked last week about tanged arrowheads, this being a bodkin from Nomadic Arts Archery in Zach Jurica. This is one of the common arrowheads I use on a lot of my reproductions, and it's an armor-piercing tanged arrowhead, which means it has this long tang here on the back side that actually is inserted into an arrow shaft. I have a bunch of them that I make myself, including bodkins and these sort of arrows. Now this is a Crimean style arrow, so it's a little bit wider head. It could be Turkish or Crimean. Now this is one of the fancy painted ones that I make, wrapped in sinew, real traditional, great arrows. But they were done this way originally. Instead of having the real common socket type arrowheads that we're used to, they were like this. So the socket heads were like this. You had these socket points that would actually, you'd cut down the front of the arrow like you would a normal modern arrowhead, and then attach it on the front with glue or adhesives, and sometimes nothing at all. But in Asia and in Eurasia, Turkey, a lot of other countries, China, Russia, the steppes, the arrowheads were done like these, with the long tang on the backside rather than the socket. The socket was actually very hard to make, so most often you would find these long tangs instead. So this is a reproduction. It's very good reproduction, and the quality is very high. So let's look at a couple of originals. This is an original Mughal point. The Mughals were an empire basically in India and around the stands that went from the 1520s all the way up into the 1850s. This would have been an armor-piercing point. Long, very, very nasty to be hit by. Good for chainmail, good for leather, good for unarmored targets. And you can see the long, real long tang, and this is where the arrow would actually have socketed all the way up to. So it would have been, this much of it would have been down inside the arrow shaft. There's a couple smaller versions that look like this. They're quite nice, and they work really well. I like them a lot. Really beautiful. There's some shorter or heavier versions, all sort of following the same style. Now, I actually do have a couple of arrows, well, more than a couple actually, that are originals. Now, these arrows would have been made out of cane. The Mughal Empire tended to use cane or bamboo for their arrows, and they would look like this. Now, these are originals out of Mike Lode's collection. Move these heads out of the way here. I really love these. These are what pretty much got me started on having original arrows. Okay, so let's look at these. The points on them, really, really pretty. This one actually has a sort of a cross between a bodkin and blade point. This would have been good for both armor and unarmored targets. You can still see the wrapping along the front. This would have been sinew. And then at the back side, the big wide knock. Now the bowstrings were much fatter back then. Unlike our real thin modern strings, they would have been very wide to accommodate a much larger string. And actually you can see, if you look real closely, it's very hard to see without a magnifier, but there's actually still some paint here. So this would have been painted all the way from the front of the sinew all the way back. And you can still see the remnants of the fletching on these arrows. So this one here, a smaller armor piercing point, also little traces of paint still left on it all the way to the back. Now this actually has an ivory knock on it. So this is a small piece of ivory that was cut in. Also the sinew, you can still see a little bit of paint along the back side, and you can see there's a real distinct patterning along the back side as well. I've seen this on a number of other arrows. The 1, 2, 3, 4 fletch would have been on this one. I don't know if that was going to be original. It's very rare to find 4-fletched arrows, but this one in particular has 4 original markings on it from where feathers would have been on it. Now this is the big surprise out of all of these. This is a very heavy, and when I say very heavy, I'll show you. So normally in grains, we tend to think of modern arrows being about 10 grains per pound for a bow. So that means, you know, a 40-pound bow would have a 400 grain arrow roughly. But these are a bit different. So let's look at one of these. So this arrow, about 320, 325 grains. Now that's not to say it would have gone for a 35-pound bow. Actually, the bow would have been much, much heavier. We tend to go about 6 grains per pound on our arrows, so that would have been most likely double that. So maybe even an 85-pound bow or 70-pound bow. But this one sort of defies all the odds. The reason is this would have been an armor-piercing arrow, and it clocks in at a whopping 996 grains. Which is astoundingly heavy for such a small, very light, very, very small profile. Now this is also cane, but very small in diameter, with also a ivory knock, and you can still see the paint on the arrow shaft. And fletching is left as well. There's another very interesting thing about this arrow, and I need a magnet to show it to you. So on your average tanged arrow like this is just a regular old shop neodymium magnet. So you can see when you touch the magnet to the shaft, you can see where the arrow, how far down the tang would have been. So right about there. Sticks real well, and if you leave it in the plastic container, it doesn't damage the arrow shaft. So you just very gently put it on there. Now, that's great. Remember our war arrow here? Yeah, that tang goes all the way, more than halfway to the fletching. That's how long a piece of steel would have been inside this arrow shaft. So to put it in perspective, that far away from the point, that's how long the tang is on that arrow, which is kind of astounding. A lot of steel, good for penetrating into armor. Now on the second one, I'm kind of curious about the same thing. Yep. Right about there. So a little bit less, believe it or not, for whatever reason, this arrow, the tang is a little bit shorter. So all of these were a little bit different. I don't think there was a whole lot of uniformity in these. This one is particularly beautiful. You can actually see a little bit of gold work behind the point. Real dark cane, probably made with a lacquer on top of it that darkened over time, and the wood probably darkened as well. But it has the most beautiful little painted flower hearts that leads back to a very wide, very large ivory knock that was actually painted on the inside with vermilion or crimson. Very, very beautiful, great piece of work, and I love the painting on these. I may try to replicate one of these down the line. So there's a few different types. They also did a smaller point that looks like one of our normal target points. but very beautiful. And this one has a wood knock, and without a magnifier, as I say, it's difficult to see, but they had a painted end, and there's little tiny dots and flowers all along where the sinew ran on the back end. And then there's a geometric pattern right here. Really beautiful. I love these originals a lot. They're a lot of fun to look at, a lot of fun to have. And on top of that, I have one last one that was out of Mike's collection. It was a 3-sided armor-piercing point. Now, we'll use a magnet. We'll find out how long the tang is on this one as well. So this would have been about 1/4 of an inch in diameter at this end. So the tang goes back right about there. So that's about, I would say, almost 4 inches from behind the point. So right to about there. 1/4 inch in diameter. So these points, while they look small, they're deceptively long in comparison to what they actually look like on the outside. What you don't see is really important. That adds a lot of weight, and it also adds a lot of stiffness to the front of the arrow, especially when you're talking about something for armor piercing. This arrow in particular is really, really pretty. It's a very light tan, really beautiful, but it has exceptionally short fletching on it, which appears to be original. It was not a flight arrow because it has an armor piercing point, but it also has that really distinctive ivory knock with painted details at the end. Just overall a very, very fine little arrow and beautiful. So these are a few of my original pieces that I've got. I wanted to show them off to you, but also wanted to show you how some of these tanged arrows work. And while the socket heads were very common in the West, the tang was pretty much the normal for the East, Asia, Southeast Asia, all the way into India, China, Russia, many of the other cultures. And in fact, the Romans and a few other cultures used the tanged arrowheads as well, but they were far more common the further east you went. So these are just a few little things wanted to show you. If you get a chance, check out my website, theflyinghun.com. Also on Instagram, we'll be doing one of these a week. So wanted to just show you a few of the things and hope you enjoyed. Have a good week. We'll see you next weekend.